Hello everyone, today we talk about the 14th century Polish kingdom restoration. I already made a specific video about the 14th century Polish kingdom for the original series. That, as I often say, is just to pave the road for this more in-depth analysis and criticism of the subject matter. Today we get a bit more into that. It's for any of our topics is always the beginning. Even if we were to make 10 videos on this subject, it would never be the end of the beginning. But the historical trajectory of Poland is interesting here. There is a process, as you know, of disgregation of the PS dynasty, essentially throughout the 13th century. Mostly had already started. It depends on what we're talking about. We're not talking about an object that can be structurally broken, right? Politics, society bring to some cooperation, conglomeration, cohesion in times, especially of expansion, for the sake just of more functional exploitation of the resources coming from the conquest. But then you can't ignore certain structural, systemic issues, right, that make, respectively, in the sense, Poland in the High Middle Ages, one of the most glamorous successes in European history, but also one of the most gradually developing countries in Central Europe in particular. Then, admittedly, the north and the east of Europe are a bit more, especially the non-post-Roman ones, a bit complicated. But the general trend of Polish history is also one of eventual recomposition. We will not, perhaps today, repeat over and over again the dynamics we already traced for this, but it's worth noticing, in fact, that the 14th century is a particularly positive moment in Polish history. It was apparently spared by the plague, which, in sheer terms of sort of absolute demographic resources, the capacity to, just in absolute terms, not in particularly qualitative ones, but to keep exporting large quantities, for example, of timber, of grain, right, even of slave. It depends on what we're talking about, which country, but the Polish landmass, its centrality across lots of very, very articulate amount of Europe. You have Scandinavia, you have Eastern Europe, you have Central Europe, you have more distant markets to reach, really has very strategic location. However, this did not mean that this recomposition process was an easy business. There were intense rivalries and shifting alliances in late medieval Central Europe that didn't have just to do with sort of Polish domestic affairs. In fact, it was a pretty international game. It was becoming ever more so. We will see now how. Right, Poland is surely going to be part of that mechanism of crowns cumulation that in late medieval Europe, especially in the last couple of centuries, will witness, in fact, different monarchs trying to concentrate power by recognizing one another, by cumulating different dynastic inheritances to try to successfully concentrate at least in one of the kingdoms. Poland is the one that comes out sort of better from the whole Central Europe. In strictly institutional terms, at least in strictly political terms, in a unitary sense, even better than Germany, but naturally Germany is sort of much bigger and powerful as a whole, right? Just is more fractured. You have, and we made lots of videos about that too, the Bohemian monarch, the kingdom ruled by the Przemysł dynasty centered in Prague and encompassing much of what is now the Czech lands. That after the devastating setback at the Battle of Markfeld, also known as the Battle on the Morava Field, or the Battle of Dürnkruth, and Jeden as I learned, ask a local from the actual pronunciation, which is dialectal, natural, fought on August 26, 1278, in present-day Lower Austria, where Bohemian King Ottokar II was crushingly defeated and killed by the forces led by the Holy Roman King Rudolf I of Habsburg, allied with Hungary, shattered, in fact, Czech ambitions in Austria, the southeastern marches turning their attention northeastward, where the fractured Piast lands offered opportunities for expansion. Right? I don't need to present the Battle of Markfeld, also because last year I started a series, because in turn you know that that's from my 270 pages long master degree, right? I went escalating, normally longer than the average, thickly, sort of with a thick, compact layout, 160 pages bachelor, 260, 270 master, 670, 720, depending on how you count the bibliography or not, the PhD thesis. And I decided to start a series about the master thesis because it's very important in my life for different reasons. I had an actual pilgrimage to the battlefield that is also one of the largest, apparently the largest in terms of, the number of feudal knights properly involved ever in Europe. It's one, the magic three that period are Markfeld, Tagliacozzo, and Benevent. They're truly the largest feudal battles of the year, and nobody really talks about them. If anything, I made a video about Tagliacozzo. I started talking in the first episode of the master thesis series that is drawn literally from my master thesis text. The problem, underrepresentation. You have these big channels that pretend to have exhausted topics in years of it. They don't even know what they're talking about. I mean, they would, as a normal person with a sort of higher sense of awareness in sort of the importance of different battles in medieval civilization, they evidently don't, right? So on Schwerpunkt, and I say it without modesty, you find a level of comparative and diachronic awareness that you will not find in any other channel, simply because I do something completely different from what most people really do, both academically and on YouTube, as a matter of fact. So here we go, I would say. And this aspect is interesting, and I'm sort of even overly simplifying, because first of all, the Battle of Markfeld was really heavy for Bohemia. That would recover, of course, like so over the years. Even these big battles would be eventually bringing to some rebooting, even of the defeated side, because of the local resources and very interesting mechanisms. We'll see better in military history videos. Rise an army once again after this generational incidents. Right, the problem wasn't much, in fact, a particular reinvigoration of Bohemia that suffered a further level of destructuring. Central European monarchies in general had problems, right? As you know, they will all explode into elective monarchies. They will all become failed states towards the later Middle Ages. So this is relevant because especially the relations between Bohemia and Poland had historically been tormented. Right, you can find some. I want to make a video probably about Bohemian-Polish warfare, because there's a very interesting military history in that. But in the video about German-Polish warfare that I made last autumn, you can find among all the various campaigns how involved the Poles were in Bohemia. And you don't have to reason much by absolute size, but by provincial situation. Right, Poland was much bigger and powerful, say on paper or on parchment, than Bohemia, but Bohemia was also more internally cohesive, compact, and Poland, as we were saying, had definitely gone under in the centuries a level of destructuring. True, and you know what we're talking about with the Piast dukes. There are all some principalities that are ruled through the principle of seniorate that mostly ends up overlapping with whoever controlled Krakow. It's actually a very similar system to the one of the Kievan Rus. In fact, I also made a video explaining how similar these two systems really were. There's a lot of warfare in there too. And so, politically speaking, there are lots of interventions here and there across different provinces and regions that these countries were basically habituated to witness to. Pretty unstable situation in general in Central Europe. Now, Wenceslas II, also known as Václav II, I made a video about him in Czech, and Václav in the second in Polish, born on September the 27th, 1271, as the only son of Ottokar II and Kunigunda of Alic to reach maturity, ascended the Bohemian throne young after his father's death and spent his minority under the regency of Otto V of Brandenburg, followed by the influence of his mother and her consort Zawisz of Falkenstein until he asserted independent rule around 1290 by executing Saint Zawisz for treason. You understand here also the situation. You have the Brandenburgers that had been allied with Ottokar II, that after the Battle of Markfeld actually marched into Bohemia to clash with Rudolf the First of Germany, that however manages to broker a deal with them. So there's a condition of power sharing in Bohemia. Ottokar had fought in the battle line, not with the other Czechs, but with the Germans, his mostly Saxon mercenaries, is also the Brandenburgers that also border Bohemia. If you're interested in the relations between the two, I not just made a video about the Margrave of Brandenburg, but also, for example, in the videos about Charles IV of Bohemia, we talked more about that because, as you know, there were further sort of irradiation of power sharing also with the Wittelsbachs, etc. Very complicated story, but hey, that's Germany in the period. And you have the mother that is actually coming from Halic, so far east, and this local noblemen that are trying, obviously, to exploit minority, this single blood, basically, that will the Przemyslids will actually die out soon in male line. However, in Poland during this period, there was a vacuum left by the brief revival under Przemysl II. This doesn't have to do probably with the Przemyslids of Bohemia. This was the Duke of Greater Poland, who briefly restored the Polish royal title after centuries of fragmentation, and who had in fact been crowned king in 1295 with papal approval secured through Archbishop Jakub Schwinka's advocacy. Schwinka is, interestingly enough, a German loan, right? There were lots of Germans of German ancestry officials in these Central European countries because of the Aussiedlung, in a properly Middle European sense, and that comes from pig, from swine. Interestingly enough, it was also a heraldic, symbol, like in this case from this clan. And this situation prompted Wenceslas II of Bohemia to sort of exploit Polish tensions, all right, after the rise of Przemysl, right? Because after the latter's murder in February 1296 near Rogoźno, Wenceslas secured the Duchy of Krakow, that is not that far away from Bohemia for that matter, where in 1291, initially ceded by Przemysl amid internal pressures, and extended control over Greater Poland himself, culminating, famously enough, I would say, if you know those year sequences, in his coronation as King of Poland himself on July the 25th, 1300, in Gniezno by Schwinka himself. Wenceslas' administration, as both king of both countries, interestingly enough, attracted substantial support from segments of Greater Poland's nobility, and especially from urban burghers, many of German descent. Right, the Czechs historically had been more Germanized, and the same Wenceslas descended from German imperial house. I mean, his great grandfather was Frederick Barbarossa himself. So, but the Bohemians in particular had. Well, of course, now the Swabian era was over, but they had historically been the sort of the best allies of the Hohenstaufen throughout most, at least, of the heyday of that royal imperial house. And there was a sense that the most civilized parts of these Western Slavic countries would be able to accumulate power mostly through reforms that entailed, in part, even a Germanization, or at least the use of officials that came from the West were more effective. They invested, they settled with more resources, and this is through the same colonization that occurred in this times. I made a video about the 13th century, which I explained a bit the Aussiedlung in these countries, how administration worked, the role of the Jews, for example. and the rising tensions of the ethnic nobility that tended to, as we were saying before, undermine probably a monarchic regime, right? And this control over two countries at a time was a way to preserve some autonomies, because this king could not be equally powerful everywhere. He had to basically float over a larger space, and therefore diluting the pressure over single places in particular. So it's a complicated history, telling the truth. Some countries were effectively created in these ways, but Central Europe had more problems, had more civilizational deficits in general by a systemic level compared to Western Europe, post-Roman Europe in particular. In any case, Greater Poland's establishment, so to say, welcomed a strong royal authority capable of curbing local magnate dominance and promising the stability needed for expanded commerce across the interconnected Bohemian Polish markets. So this was in theory, especially because this rule existed from the main cities, the main towns, the markets, etc. Was, of course, there was a component of the same nobility pushing for this, because there were always factional divisions within each estate. But there is a sense, again, that the third estate is undermining the traditional ethnic nobility and their latifundia, their prerogatives in the kingdom, by making leverage on this foreign ruler, right? And you know that these countries historically will have foreign dynasties, the Anjous, both in Poland and in Hungary, the Luxembourgs in Bohemia. Now, this economic appeal was reinforced by Wenceslas's masterful development of Bohemia's silver wealth after the major silver deposits discovery at Kutna Hora, a mining town, as you know, in central Bohemia, where rich veins were exploited starting around 1298, fueling economic boom. He imposed a royal monopoly on extraction, obviously, issued the widely accepted Prague groschen coin of high silver content. This was a large silver that became, in fact, as a consequence, the key regional currency, and promulgated the detailed Jus Regale Montanorum in 1300 to govern mining administration, technical standards, and revenue collection, generating resources that sustained his multi-kingdom ambitions until his premature death on June the 21st, 1305. Right? If you're interested in seeing how this developed also in a social sense in Bohemia, I made a video about 14th century Bohemia as well, then essentially pre-Hussite era society that talks also about Kutna Hora, the mining rights of the crown and so on. Wenceslas died likely of tuberculosis as he was only 33. Yet this externally imposed rule in Poland quickly encountered fierce resistance, predictably enough. Remember, this is just a chunk of Poland that, in fact, does not speak for the rest of it. There can be more or less seniorate recognitions, right, of monarchy, etc. But the country is also vast. I mean, Poland is big, it's extended, it's not particularly well interconnected, and all the ducal lines of the PS are out there, right? Some will also survive within the crown of Bohemia later on, as you know, in Silesia. I made lots of videos about Bohemian history also in the early modern age. You can check those out, especially in the playlist about Habsburgic history. Now, Ladislaus the Short, Władysław the First Łokietek, roughly 1260-61, March the 2nd, 1333. It was a tenacious Piast duke originating from Kujawia. We have to resume also the historical regional series for this matter. It was a historical region in Central Europe, right, north of Greater Poland. He skillfully mobilized the resentment against a foreign monarch who favored Czech and German appointees in key positions. The third son of Duke Casimir I of Kujawia by his third wife, Eufrosyne of Opole, with older half-brothers Leszek II the Black and Zimomir from Casimir's second marriage to Constance of Wrocław, Ladislaus inherited only a modest share of Brześć Kujawski after his father's 1267 death, spending his early years under maternal regency and later at the Krakow court of his relative Boleslav V, the Chaste. His political education included early diplomatic missions, such as the 1273 arbitration involving the Teutonic Knights that we were discussing the other day, military support from Leszek II from 1279 onward in wars against Mazovian princes. Mazovia is basically the region of today's Warsaw in the northeast. This was not particularly developed at the time, but it was mounting up in importance. It was big and sort of wilder, and so its critical mass could not be ignored. Also, he participated in monastic reforms at Sulejov. The church naturally was very important for cementing seigneurial power locally. It was very privately controlled by the Szlachta historically. The same Polish bishops will notoriously develop their own private armies at a point, etc. Now, following Leszek's death without heirs in 1288, Ladislaus inherited Siraj and positioned himself in the contest for the seigneurate province encompassing Krakow and Sandomierz, allying with Boleslav II of Mazovia against Henry IV, Probus of Wrocław. Their victory at Siewierz in February 1289 came at high cost, but demonstrated his growing military reputation. If you're interested in Polish warfare, this year I made multiple videos about Polish tactics, military units, and we will hopefully come back soon to it. His name, Łokietek, elbow high, recorded centuries later by Jan Długosz as denoting physical shortness. Recent endoscopic examination of his tomb in 2019 measured 152-55 centimeters, slightly below contemporary averages. May also have carried a contemporary connotation of the limited scale of his original patrimony, contrasted with his relentless pursuit of greater authority. Ladislaus nevertheless forged vital partnerships with Pope Boniface VIII, one of the greatest popes in the history of the Church, and whose support proved instrumental in later coronation efforts, with Charles Robert of Anjou, during the latter's contest for Hungary, formalized through the June 6, 1320 marriage of Ladislaus's daughter Elizabeth to Charles Robert. If you're interested in this sovereign, Carobert of Hungary made a video about 14th century Hungary for the original series, and with Ruthenian and Aletsch princes who provided eastern backing against Bohemian pressure. The sudden deaths of Wenceslas II, as you've seen on June 21st, 1305, and Wenceslas III on August 4th, 1306, in Olomouc, ending the Przemysł dynasty in the male line and plunging Bohemia into succession turmoil, opened the momentum window for Ladislaus, who returned from exile that had lasted from 1300 to 1304, possibly including Rome for the 1300 Jubilee, as a matter of fact. He expelled rival claimants, including John of Luxembourg, who retained the titular Polish kingship claim until 1335, interestingly enough, because these were already those who had, by that point, installed themselves in Bohemia. It was a real problem. And the same Rudolf of Habsburg, by the way, because this is somehow little known, but the Habsburgs at the end of the 13th century had also the titular kingship of Bohemia and Poland. And we really have to dig a bit deeper into history to explain why that was the case. But in a sense, this coverage by major authorities was obviously sought after in times of turmoil. And this is exactly the situation we're painting here. He also reestablished control over Sandomierz and Krakow, making a ceremonial entry into the quote-unquote capital, that is Krakow, obviously, on September 1st, 1306, accompanied by city privileges and reconciliation overtures toward former Czech loyalists such as Bishop Jan Muskata. Despite these advances, major reversal followed. In 1308, the Teutonic Knights, so the German Catholic military order originally founded for crusading in the Holy Land but active in the Baltic region since the 13th century, and technically a vassal of Poland, at least for a great deal of the land they controlled there, having conquered Prussia on behalf of the Polish kings and having established a monastic state on their own there, however, seized eastern Pomerania, carrying out massacres, by the way, against populations in Danzig, Gdansk, and Chev. Initially summoned by Ladislaus's governor Bogusza to break a Brandenburg siege of Gdansk castle during the Svienza family's rebellion aligned with Margrave Valdemar, the knights under Günther von Schwarzburg arrived in summer 1308 with 100 knights and 200 auxiliaries, reinforced the Polish garrison, but soon quarreled over command authority and promised compensation. If you're interested in the figure of Günther von Schwarzburg, that will become anti-king and competitor with Saint Charles of Bohemia later on, you should check out the video on him. His panoply from the burial monument at the Frankfurt Cathedral you can admire still today, as well as, in fact, that video on the rise of Charles IV of Bohemia. Right, interesting figure, and you understand here how sort of Mitteleuropa has its own sort of specific space within which different nations interact on each other's territory and so on. The Teutonic move was historically to secure, also through Hanseatic support, the control of the Baltic coastline. And this was very dangerous for Poland because basically they were severed from the most important markets. Right, all their rivers flowed towards the north. The markets there were controlled by the Germans. The Poles did not really have the socio-economical, but in particular political military cohesion at this point to dislodge the Germans. It will take a while, before another century, and the alliance with the Lithuanians, that were actually former enemies of the Poles, to achieve that, right? But this battling, the habit of not just German, but also Czech noblemen, Ottokar II had founded the same Königsberg, for that matter, to the Baltic Crusades, had habituated this sort of back and forth of knights, their companies, etc. And Günther here helps the Poles, but again, soon quarrels over command authority and promised compensation, and naturally German help was handsomely paid. There is all the sort of the difference here in terms of military culture between a Poland that has to yet fully, but at this point really has westernized in military culture. There's always some sort of ethnic bias towards some lighter cavalry step influence. We've seen it also in Bohemia, that was even more westernized than Poland. The Germans are a bit the gold standard in terms especially of military technology, of business models. Now, after Brandenburg forces departed, tensions escalated into open war further. Anyway, on the evening of November the 12th, 1308, the Teutonic Order forced entry into the town, overcame defenders, including burghers, Pomeranian knights, and remaining Brandenburg elements, in street-by-street fighting, and completed the takeover by morning of November the 13th. Right. Contemporary papal accusations in Clement V's 1310 bull claimed over 10,000 killed, including infants, likely inflated for rhetorical effect, possibly sourced from Riga Archbishop Friedrich von Pernstein amid separate order disputes. This was not, however, very peaceful storming and also handling of the local population. Remember, the Teutonic Knights are, not particularly sensitive to things like human mercy or something like that. And these inhabitants are also, aside from having resisted them, not quite of the prime kind that the Germans would have respected. Testimonies from the 1320-1321 Wrocław Brześć Kujawski papal inquest and the 1339 Warsaw proceedings, combined with order admissions, indicate dozens of prominent Pomeranian knights slain. The knights considered 15 to 16 named individuals and several hundred to approximately 1,000 commoners and townspeople from an estimated urban population of 2,000 to 3,000, including adjacent settlements, many executed after surrender. So definitely it was a massacre. It was pretty darn bloody in probably relative terms, and also sort of in absolute ones. Archaeological evidence reveals widespread destruction, by the way, burned layers and deliberate terrain leveling across much of the site in 1308, 1309, compelling evacuations and prompting immigration, notably to Lübeck, right, the mother city, so to say, of the Hanseatic League, further west. Events memorialized in Polish tradition as the Gdansk Massacre or Rzecz Gdańska. The conquest allowed, in any case, the Teutonic Order to occupy the remainder of Pomerania, secured legally through the 1309 Treaty of Soldin, whereby Brandenburg sold its claims for 10,000 marks, linking the Prussian state territorially to the Holy Roman Empire and depriving Poland in this way of its principal Baltic outlet for generations. This was in the northwest, right? The Teutonic Order had historically centered in the northeast compared to Poland. So mostly the Vistula river mouth was the most important, had been closed, or at least, heavily told for Polish merchants. Pomerania had been we'll make more, that's a very interesting historical region to cover as such. It was always remains a kind of frontier area. Also the Danes at some point got there, and it was complicated to control. The Poles had once reached, in the early days of the PS conquests, but their grip on it had always been feeble at the end of the day. Ladislaus's path to undisputed kingship had begun earlier, but encountered repeated obstacles. Przemysł II, as we've seen before, crowned king on June 26, 1295 in Gniezno by Archbishop Jakub Zwinka, who among other things was an ardent nationalist prelate who orchestrated anti-German and anti-Bohemian alliances, had briefly revived the royal title with papal sanction and incorporated Gdansk Pomerania from 1294 under the succession agreement with Mestwin II. Yet Przemysł's murder on February 8, 1296, during a failed abduction attempt near Rogozno, involving Nawecz and Zaremba clan elements, and possibly instigated by Brandenburg interests, exploiting his testament, designated Henry III of Glogov as heir, shattered that revival. That control over Pomerania was really about probably the general honor and international standing of the Polish kingdom. Ladislaus emerged as successor, as we've seen in Greater Poland, through the Krzywin Compromise of March 10, 1296, which partitioned the region but quickly disintegrated amid rampant banditry, ecclesiastical opposition led by Bishop Andrzej Zaremba of Poznan, and mounting southern pressure from Wenceslas II that forced Ladislaus, as we have seen before, into exile from 1299, 1300 to 1304. Only to be deposed himself, however, in 1300 as Wenceslas consolidated power, rendering that unification attempt unsuccessful as well, right? Challenges persisted even after Ladislaus's territorial recoveries. A major revolt, for example, broke out in Krakow in 1311, incited by Mayor Albert and Bishop Jan Muscata, both committed supporters of John of Luxembourg, who argued, as we've seen before, that a Luxembourg ruler would better advance the city's commercial and developmental interests amid the fiscal burdens of unification and the economic fallout from Pomerania's loss. So at this point, the Polish kingdom was risking to be weakened, destabilized once again. The Luxembourg's promise was, again, mostly to the Krakow was the most important city, by the way, probably in size and economical force. And so to the third estaters to have some decentralized but florid position in exchange for the recognition of a rule that would have never been too solid anyway. It was possible from the general Bohemian perspective to invade these parts of Poland, but simply to stay, right, and to simply parcel out a chunk of Poland in the short, medium term for Bohemia would have been really impractical. There were, by the way, other lands in between, such as Silesia But in any case, the insurgents seized parts of Krakow. This was mostly a Polish domestic issue, let's be honest. Summoned Bolko I of Opole, but proved unable to capture Wawel castle. Ladislaus, reinforced by Hungarian contingents, remember the connection with Karabert, crushed the uprising in 1312, imposing harsh reprisals, including executions of councillors, confiscation of properties, revocation of certain privileges, and replacement of German with Latin in municipal records as a symbolic assertion of Polish royal dominance. This is quite fascinating for a number of reasons, because these years are the ones of the home fight of Henry VII in Italy. Right? The fact that the Angevins are allied with the Poles against the Luxembourgs mirrors the fact that they were fighting themselves with Italian Guelphs against the Imperials in Italy during these terrible times of at least enormously scaled warfare, right? So you understand how Europe is all a bit engulfed in these affairs. Resistance to Ladislaus' rule in Greater Poland endured until 1314, when local knighthood rose against the fragmented rule of Henry III of Glogov's sons, who had controlled much of the province since 1306, defeated their troops, occupied Poznan, and invited Ladislaus to assume authority. He entered the city in August 1314, and thereafter styled himself Prince of the Polish Kingdom. Right? The existence of a knightly estate in Poznan and in general, like in Poland, to support a king against the higher nobility is a pattern that shows you how vital, right, also Polish society as well, like in how the various estates' participation to politics really was. Of course, the knights were a bit unavoidably the numerical and qualitative backbone of the Polish armies at this point. But so the national expression of need for a strong ruler from Poland here is intense in different areas. There is the demand, yes, for a better sort of mechanism of government that would exclude at least the more problematic oligarchs that would routinely engulf, like in this case, Henry III of Glogov's sons, the royal policy, and therefore the whole country. But also, this support speaks of the necessary affirmation of a traditional rule of those who bore arms, and so not simply like some merchants from Krakow sponsored by a French ruler and his German acolytes. Ultimately, in 1320, Ladislaus achieved broad recognition as king across the realm. As a consequence, significantly, his coronation took place in Krakow's Wawel Cathedral on January the 20th, 1320, conducted by Archbishop Stanislaw of Gniezno, following reluctant papal approval from John the 22nd on August the 20th, 1319, because politics, in any case, change, even a big deal. Now we don't have time to digress on all this, but this was also amidst the early clash between the Wittelsbachs, the Luxembourgs, the Habsburgs, so it's very complicated. It's not just a monofactorial thing. The Luxembourgs were hated by the Pope. No, there is a general interest that changed year after year, month after month even. And this crowning, by the way, was deliberately confined in scope to sidestep Bohemian objections over Greater Poland, right? And, rather than, for example, the crowning in traditional Gniezno site, marking a lasting shift towards Krakow as the emerging political and ceremonial center. Anyway, the kingdom Ladislaus governed covered roughly 110,000 square kilometers with a population slightly exceeding 1 million, scarcely half the extent held by the early PS rulers, as a matter of fact. As we were saying before, Poland was pretty big extensionally, but demographic concentration was pretty scarce. It was really typical of Central Europe, and the more north and east you go. Still, this whole mechanism represented a durable reestablishment of unity, right? If anything, cohesion, political unity are a great recipe for solidity, right? Regardless of resources. Despite ongoing tensions between Greater and Lesser Poland, it obviously remained somehow autonomous and, hostile. Persistent ethnic frictions between Slavic and German populations that existed at a societal level as well, and the continued activity of regional confederations, the reconstituted Polish state persisted without catastrophic rupture until the partitions of the 18th century. Up to a few generations prior, you could have really not said this, right? Poland could simply explode in some similar way the Rus would. It was admittedly more cohesive, more concentrated, was historically closer to civilization, but in general, like, it could fail as a state much earlier. There was nothing historically so deterministic about the Poles as just one of the tribes inhabiting what will become more or less at the moment, the early PS extension, more or less the same boundaries of today's Poland. And Poland is, as you know, historically shifted further east and acquires some sort of rhomboid shape, but the original Poland was actually pretty much the same one you can see on the map today, ironically enough. And for the Poles, it would have been better if it had remained the more recent shape, as a matter of fact, for different reasons, and we'll come back on them. But you want to appreciate that, in fact, this rapid PS conquest was not merely ephemeral, that there was a capacity to seed power, properly the institutional foundation of what will become, especially in the later Middle Ages, the early modern era, one of the strongest power in Europe. Known as the restorer of Polish unity, Ladislaus bequeathed the throne to his son Casimir in 1333. We had a particularly long reign, and the one that is mostly remembered as the sort of the heyday of 14th century Poland. Under Casimir, later honored as Casimir the Great, Casimir III Wielki, born on April the 3rd, 1310 in Kowal, Kujawia, and reigned from April the 25th, 1333 until his death on November the 5th, 1370, the Polish kingdom attained the high point of its medieval evolution. The final mark of the PS line demonstrated exceptional skill in maintaining domestic equilibrium and achieving territorial growth primarily through calculated diplomacy rather than unrelenting warfare. This was admittedly a time of greater exhaustion of the medieval civilizational cake, right? The cooling off this massive Eurasian development, and therefore warfare also, in a general political and social sense, was not actually less overall in Europe, but Poland could exploit, as we've seen, its partial insulation, also because of its size. Like, what do you do? You go at war with Poland to do what exactly, right? To which parts to actually take? Because of, again, it was spared by the Black Death that would occur, in fact, under Casimir, and lots of other interesting dynamics, right? Casimir, as we've seen now, he inherited his reign from his father's death at Wawel. Poland was still a fragile domain after all. It never really surpassed its fundamental issues, like oligarchy, privatization was always there, right? Poland will eventually be partitioned at the end of the day because of this, but it evidently had a massive drive, right? Mostly, say, it was in line, considering the times and the places, with some general level of substantial institutional development. The monarchy could have at some point ideally succeeded. The main bulk of Casimir's power was the devastated Lesser Poland and Greater Poland. By the way, he didn't even control, as we explained, the entirety of the country. There was the intermediate Legisa and Ziraj lands held in temporary Kujawian administration. To the fragmented duchies received from his father, Casimir introduced cohesive institutions and administrative frameworks. The skilled jurists surrounding him in particular promoted the guiding ideal of, quote, one prince, one law, and one coinage throughout the entire kingdom. It was a massive effort at sort of modernizing Poland through a more uniform administration, more power concentration from the side of the kingdom. Casimir codified Polish customary law in the statutes of Wyszlica, promulgated on March 11, 1347, establishing civil and criminal norms for Lesser Poland, because every province historically had its own customs, and so it's complicated to simply... This is not a process of centralization. I use better the term concentration because that's sort of more juridically proper. I made some videos about the history of law until Napoleon, that there are critical differences in how sort of medievals ruled themselves compared to contemporary states. And Piotrków, this was extended between 1356 and 62 to Greater Poland, diminishing regional legal disparities, obviously very important for government, strengthening royal prerogative vis-a-vis nobility and clergy. So obviously there was a cooptation of still the higher princes of the kingdom, safeguarding peasants, however, against arbitrary noble or ecclesiastical oppression. This earned Casimir the colloquial epithet the peasant's king for adjudicating in favor of the vulnerable, at least ideally, and reaffirming and broadening protections for Jewish communities, expanding upon Boleslav's the Chaste's 1264 Statute of Kalisz, which imposed capital punishment for kidnapping Jewish children, for forced baptism, and for desecrating Jewish cemeteries, thereby facilitating a substantial Jewish immigration and an economic integration that positioned Poland as a major center of Ashkenazi life. And these two processes are very relevant. The peasantry in Poland, generally in Central Europe, or rather, let's not even discuss Eastern Europe, was they were considered animals, essentially. Like, there wasn't properly a mentality in Central Europe where the peasant was considered like a person in practice, right? The Polish Szlachta was ferociously sort of oligarchic in nature. There wasn't properly, especially in these Western Slavic countries, like some robust third estate and sort of scattered across the we recently made a video about the charters issued by lords in places like Italy as early as the 12th century. Like, in these countries, there would hardly ever be such a thing like that. That's also why, for example, so much German settlement at a point, at least it was still being favored in Poland, just not too much in the administration per se. Actually, the immunities for the Jews were themselves a very old mechanism to allow essentially a level of political centralization of bureaucracy of administration to through putting money lending mostly in the hands of the Jews. In this sense, we're not representing any other sort of power out there. It's not like the Germans who were sort of difficult neighbors that pushed, in any case, to expand, to infiltrate. You needed them to some degree. Jews depended just on the local benevolence, right? And after, especially the great diaspora of the Khazars, destroyed by the Kievan Rus back in the day. I also made an entire video about those campaigns between the 10th and 11th century. Countries like Poland in particular, also Eastern Europe in general, but the Western Slavs too, Bohemia, Hungary, had obviously used these Jews that had also some broader commercial connections internationally speaking, also for basically the same reasons that we described here, right? So the objective is to essentially nationalize the kingdom's establishment, obviously co-opting the local nobility because there was no other way to rule a country like this, but not injecting other foreigners, just using the Jews for these administrative tasks. At the same time, in fact, reducing the abuses over these communities, the asset of the peasants in general, especially in a moment where, as we were saying before, Polish grain exports to foreign lands will dramatically increase. And so the peasantry could also represent for the monarchy some sort of leverage on the same nobility. In Poland, it will never go as far, right? Because the peasants really, in interest of relative local power, especially towards the nobility, never stood much of a chance to begin with. But still, right, as a quite liberal policy, as quite sort of a new one, especially in the Polish mentality. These legal reforms conferred upon Casimir the informal designation of the Polish Justinian for their systematic approach to judiciary harmonization, their contribution to social balance among nobility, clergy, burghers, and peasantry, while stimulating commerce, finance, and urban development. Casimir himself was attentive to these legal matters. He was involved in this. He worked a lot really with his collaborators for issuing this legal codes that were, again, a form of definitely an instrument of political concentration that would actually succeed. A unified monarchy encompassing the full crown lands of Poland required that dukes in peripheral territories, particularly Silesia, Kujawia, and Mazovia, formally acknowledge royal overlordship. It would have still been a matter of decentralized rule, but still the acknowledgement, in a broader political sense, more would have been yielding really a lot in terms of kingly power. These outlying rulers frequently gravitated toward external allegiances instead. Right, this had been particularly the case for those in the south and in the west, because they were more stimulated by more powerful rulers around. Ladislaus the Short had already established royal precedence over Kujawia and Mazovia, as we've seen. Those other lands were a bit more complicated to recover. Some had been heavily Germanized, think about Silesia. They were also bordering with Bohemia, as we've seen, harbored plans of further expansion against Poland and general resentment because of similar Polish initiatives from the other direction. During Casimir's reign, the extinction of local PS lines in those duchies permitted the direct not all of them, the direct reintegration into the royal domain. That mattered because, as we've seen, oligarchs are a problem, but they also care very much about inheritance rights, sort of dynastic succession. So when a lineage goes extinct, aside from the sort of the material basis from which somebody will still remain there, like there was all the mean, like the moral capacity to sometimes reclaim those lands from the crown's side. Yet inheritance claims alone could not ensure effective sovereignty either. Right, genuine control demanded reinforcement through centralized governance, exemplified by the construction of nearly 30 fortified towns in approximately 50 stone castles, most famously along the defensive chain known as the Trail of the Eagle's Nest, Szlak Orlich Gniazd, a line of about 25 medieval castles and watchtowers stretching from Krakow to Częstochowa in the Polish Jura region, largely built or rebuilt in the 14th century to protect southern borders against Bohemian threats in particular, right? There was an achievement immortalized in the saying that Casimir, quote, found Poland wooden and left it built of brick and stone, a bit like, the famous quote about Augustus. But this is very interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, consider that Poland had not really had much of this infrastructure prior. Right, the Mongol invasion, 3 Mongol invasions of Poland occurred, definitely brought about a radical change. All right, the stone castles in particular were founded from that point onward. It wasn't much even just a problem of defense from the Mongols in particular. It was about the change that those invasions had brought in society. Right, peasants had collapsed further. They needed more protection, so the local lords got more power, including the same peasants' labor, construction force, etc. And so there is a seigneurialization of power. This is something that happens also in the Kievan Rus, as you know, in the broader Eastern European world, as a consequence of this also injection of more sort of Asiatic overlordship, sort of authoritarian rule, right? Poland is deeply impacted by this as well. So there is a societal sort of precondition for that. Encastellation was also something relatively recent in Poland. Consider that stone castles on a regular basis built sort of the top tier level of fortifications were in the Baltic, arriving just by the 12th century, right? And in the Polish hinterland, it took even longer. So you understand how relatively recent the foundations for a proper kingdom ruled in ways at least not particularly similar, nor particularly comparable to the ones, say, of, I don't know, France, England, etc., but in a way that would look at least as a more territorially, sort of regionally cohesive dominion. Something new also in Polish mentality. There is a factor that a mix of coincidence here that you have to consider under reign of Casimir. The other aspect is that there is enough power concentration, enough surplus in the hands of the crown to start building a regional border chain of fortifications that have properly to secure the borders with Bohemia. Right, so that's quite interesting as well. That's historic also the reason in the longer run why the capital will be shifted from Krakow to Warsaw, right? The starosta system, that is provincial governorships initially instituted under the Przemyslids, persisted unchanged. These officials appointed and removable solely at royal will, wielded the crown's executive and judicial power regardless of local immunities or privileges. At the apex of the state machinery stood the royal chancery, which replaced the independent chanceries previously maintained by separate dukes. Prominent among its personnel were eminent civil lawyers such as the Grand Chancellor Jan Suchewilk and Vice Chancellor Janko of Czarnkov, author of a celebrated contemporary chronicle, among other things. 14th century is also a great moment of artistic, as we'll see now, cultural production in Poland. Properly, Polish vernacular emerges in a more evident sense as a literary language. Although Ladislaus had summoned convenciones magna or generales merely 4 times during his reign, these were gatherings patterned after provincial assemblies that served simultaneously as regional courts convening high magnates, senior clergy, and chosen delegates from nobility, towns, and cathedral chapters. No fully developed estate parliament had yet emerged. There was no political need for that. It was understood that even sort of giving the king such sort of satisfaction of seeing all the estates gathered from the country would have been too much. There were, again, some lands that were autonomous. They did not really want to know much of that rule to begin with, if not for their own possible accession, which was evidently not the case. However, there is a sort of gradual affirmation of these councils that definitely corresponds on a smaller scale to some kind of parliamentary convention. The baronial council operated as the principal executive body staffed by leading state dignitaries. After 1320, these office holders increasingly originated from less exalted lineages as well. This was a form of cooptation of the sort of the more important of society, but not the most important of society. It was a way to, again, having these officials lean in favor of the monarchy. Casimir ruled chiefly through a compact circle of Krakow-based nobles whose advancement hinged on royal patronage. After all, this inner group deliberated critical policies and proposed appointments to major offices. Even so, under Casimir and his immediate successors, the council retained an informal character rather than an institutionalized advisory institution. In contrast, the Conventa Magna or Conventa Solemna gained greater prominence during Ladislaus's reign, assembling near annually and occasionally twice within a single year. Uniformity in law remained difficult to achieve. Many Polish towns and villages operated under Magdeburg law that had been, as you know, modeled after one of the most important German communal ones for a big part, actually the majority, especially of the continental Ostsiedlung communities, but also some probably national Slavic communes that were imitating it. Also, some lords adopted it for the local communities. And again, I discussed this in that video about the 13th century Ostsiedlung, and you realize how at some point certain German communities absorbed some Slavic elements as well that became German that way by law, because essentially the main indicator at that point was juridical, right? It corresponded obviously to ethnocultural differences, but in an institutional political sense, it mattered what kind of university you are part of, right? What kind of guild, what kind of community, what kind of commune. And this Magdeburg law granted many Polish towns and villages significant self-government, while still subjecting them to royal fiscal demands, contrary to occasional claims of complete exemption. Casimir actively promoted urban expansion by issuing more than 100 town foundation charters, including the aforementioned fortified ones that worked in some sort of military colonies, systematizing urban taxation as well. This was for the bigger centers, and integrating burghers into the kingdom's economic and political fabric. You couldn't do without those either, right? Especially considering that during and after the Black Death crisis, international trade will actually increase. This may seem paradoxical, but since the elites had gained more traction in society, the range of their exchange increased, right? This happened, as we were saying at the beginning, even among kings that would sort of share, they would try to marry into one another to concentrate the inheritance of their respective crowns, about this stuff. But you need it, at least in some major centers, that will become more important, while others will definitely fade. Important third estate mechanisms that you had to foster, to also to use against the Szlachta, that was the more encumbrant presence there. The nobility and peasantry continued to follow traditional Polish customary law in general. However, the Magdeburg law was just for, again, specifically newly founded communities, right, either by the king or just as it was happening through German colonization. The interesting aspect about traditional Polish customary law is that Poland was now more committed to writing it down under Casimir's own direction. That's also why you see more vernacular, why you see more regulation in general, right? This is normal, generally speaking, with the late medieval crisis. There's paradoxically more documentary evidence emerging because the crisis had to regulate things as it had not quite happened. So, as you understand, like in other realms in Europe, everything starts crystallizing in terms of political and institutional form and substance. Royal edicts, especially those concerning economic matters, gradually extended kingdom-wide application across all social orders. Casimir did not succeed, however, in establishing a unified national currency centered on the Krakow groschen, by the way. As we've seen also for Bohemia, you had the major city that has minting rights and everything. It's not the only one, but it's also containing more precious metal and as such setting the gold or silver standards, as we've seen before, for some part of the country or in other markets, but doesn't mean that it's universal. There's no way, again, to coerce the entire country, this vast, by some level, politically and geographically disarticulated, just to follow this or that currency. That did not make sense. It was still not a need, but the chance of doing so was starting to appear, and it was worth investing in. Poland lacked the abundant mineral wealth of Hungary or Bohemia. By the way, there weren't many mines there. Lesser Poland contained modest silver mines together with limited copper deposits. Silesia possessed gold and silver resources, but as we've seen before, Bohemian dominance prevailed there. Hungarian currency circulated extensively within the Polish kingdom as well and predominated in international transactions in general. Right? Hungary was not particularly more advanced than Poland in a broader sense, but it was bigger and it had some sort of more imperial and predatory capacity. So in general, it was really the giant at this point, was ruled by the Angevin house that will eventually rule for a while also in Poland. After this, taxation advanced substantially despite monetary limitations. Urban levies had already been regularized under the final two PS kings. The crown's vigorous recovery of alienated royal estates provoked in 1352 a noble league in Greater Poland under Voivode Maciej Borkowicz, directed against the local starosta. This confrontation inadvertently accelerated the founding of numerous small towns through letters of location granting municipal rights. The royal domain underwent thorough administrative reorganization supported by an ever-growing archive of surveys documenting land measurements and projected revenues. A single general tax replaced the patchwork of earlier ducal exactions. As international trade flourished across the century, customs receipts grew correspondingly. By its close, the Polish treasury derived its principal income from the salt mines of Bochnia and Wieliczka, acquired under royal authority between 1273 and 1278, and reorganized in 1368 under the office of the Great Salt Maker. These mines produced more than 12,000 tons of salt annually, sustaining considerable exports to Hungary and southern Rus as well. This is the measure, as we were saying, the second half of the 14th century, where Poland, spared by the Black Death, has a lot of labor force to export great agricultural resources to surrounding countries. Think about the southern Rus that, yes, was in a bit of political trouble and sort of infested by the Turco-Mongols, but historically was, in fact, exporting grain itself, as it would still do, right? Hungary also had actually a big agricultural production. The fact that Poland manages to export this also more far away in the Baltic, after all, is a big motive. Casimir's foreign policy emphasized pragmatic stability over aggressive conquest. This, we said it before. He however, updated the army, stabilized relations with Bohemia by accepting Silesian losses while preventing ecclesiastical separation and securing formal renunciation of Polish claims through payments totaling 1.2 million Prague groschen in negotiations culminating at Trenčín and Visegrad in 1335-1339, and reached compromise with the Teutonic Order via the Treaty of Kalisz in 1343, regaining Dobrzyn land, the one of that old order we also made a video on, monastic military order, and Kuyavia, while conceding Pomerelia as perpetual ecclesiastical alms following Visegrad arbitration involving John of Luxembourg and Charles Robert as well. It's quite fascinating that, again, you could basically regulate whatever was happening between the Danube and the Baltic amidst this sort of international gatherings of royalty, or at least royal officials. This tells you the degree by which these countries were now enucleating themselves in the international arena, how much they necessitated to regulate trade in ever smoother ways and not just in a more fluid, dynamic situation where just the strongest was able to seize what they wanted. In some ways, they would do that, and a tradition will continue, for example, with the Teutonic Order in any case. However, you realize that there are some very pragmatic choices that actually reinforce the solidity of the Polish kingdom. There is some general stability. I mean, not even the Bohemians wanted to be at war perennially with Poland or whatever. Like, warfare was incredibly costly. We still have to make videos about later medieval Polish warfare because we made something, about the High Middle Ages. We really need to update Schwerpunkt regarding late medieval Polish warfare, the 14th to 15th century, because there was really a lot there. Simultaneously, Casimir pursued eastward expansion, however, into Red Ruthenia. So we're talking Galicia, Volhynia. I made multiple videos on those regions through campaigns from 1340 to 1366. We have documented them already. Triggered, in fact, by the extinction of the local Rurikid line with the deaths of Andrew and Lev II, the Poles successfully incorporating the territory, securing access to Black Sea commerce, and encouraging settlement in centers such as Lviv. It will become Lvov because of its majority Polish Jewish establishment in an ocean of Ruthenian, of Ukrainian. This is it's very foundational of sort of the centuries afterward, right? I made an entire video explaining how the Poles moved down the Carpathians, all right, in the east, also struggling over the control of these Ruthenian lands with the Hungarians that considered some of these territories as a possession of their crown, right? Interestingly enough, the Poles extend Magdeburg rights to Lviv in 1356, all right? So this was a way, as we said before, to reward particular centers, the more important ones historically, to become the big markets of the situation, especially in this agriculturally yielding countries, and so making them more easily controllable from the center. If you're interested in these topics, by the way, I have a pretty hefty Ukrainian history playlist you can check out, because we discuss this ethnic divides also between the various estates at a point. The Ruthenians were seeking essentially protection from the more powerful rulers of the West, including the papacy, ecclesiastically speaking, because of the pressure that the Tatars put on them. Although they remain actually the more developed parts of Ruthenia, civilizing the conquering Lithuanians at this point, that sort of saved them from the Mongols, the Golden Horde. A committed patron of education and culture, Casimir established the University of Krakow. Importantly speaking, today's Jagiellonian University, that, the Jagiellonians were not there, they were there, but not in Poland yet, founded by royal charter on May 12, 1364, with papal permission from Urban V, making it the second oldest university in Central Europe after Prague, as well as the oldest in Poland, and convened the notable Congress of Krakow in 1364. At the same time, they are gathering multiple monarchs to discuss Central European peace and cooperation. Consider that the Ottoman Turks were already spawning in the Balkans, right? We have seen this, in some videos about Serbian warfare. We should make more about that. As a matter of fact, Central Europe as a whole already understood that things could precipitate from there. Yes, there was, from a Polish perspective, a lot in between them and the Turks, but not quite so stable that they could simply rely on it, right? It was a greater effort, an attempt at stabilization. Here, Poland acts a bit as a mediator. They still have massive problems. The Teutonic Order just impending on, like Damocles' sword. However, they were doing really their best under Casimir to concentrate and stabilize power. The central financial administration, headed by the Grand Treasurer of the kingdom, implemented increasingly stringent accounting and auditing practices. In essence, the groundwork for a modern fiscal state took firm shape during this era. Casimir, renowned for adjudicating in favor of the disadvantaged against noble or clerical, as we've said before, also, the prelates were quite sort of positively seigneurial in their authority, overreach, and for cultivating equilibrium among social estates, the only way to actually allow the monarchy to power concentrate, produced, however, no legitimate male heir despite 4 marriages. To Aldona Anna of Lithuania in 1325, yielding daughters Elizabeth and Kunigunda before Aldona's death in 1339, to Adelaide of Hesse in 1341, childless and soon separated, secretly to Christina Rokichana, a merchant widow, interestingly enough, and to Edvig of Jagan around 1365, producing 3 daughters, Anna, Kunigunda, and Jadwiga. The latter, is a name that recurs, but that's also for another video. And whose legitimacy required papal intervention in 1369 and 1371. Succession arrangements included the 1355 Buda Pact, naming nephew Louis I of Hungary as heir, and an unsuccessful attempt to adopt grandson Casimir IV of Pomerania. Upon Casimir's death, following a hunting injury, the throne passed to Louis in 1370, concluding Piast's dynastic rule and inaugurating a Hungarian personal union. Nevertheless, Casimir's legacy persisted through consolidated institutions, eastward territorial gains, importantly enough, extensive fortification, as we've seen, systematic legal codification, more importantly, expanded urban rights and advanced fiscal mechanisms that elevated Poland to the zenith of its medieval power and laid enduring foundations for its future development. We're going to definitely look at Casimir, in any case, more and better in other videos, because he's essentially the Polish 14th century, and one just before essentially the brief Angevin, and then the Jagiellonian phases. It takes a lot, obviously, to properly cover all these topics in a satisfactory manner. If you're interested, you can look at another great ruler, that is Casimir IV. Interestingly enough, it was a bit the equivalent of his namesake, the third, in the 15th century. That's the moment in which Poland, at least sort of the possessions of the crown of Poland, or at least the dynastic sum of the Jagiellonian kings that mostly based in Poland, reached its maximum extent, right? They encompassed vast areas, including, say, nominally Hungary, etc. And we can witness to an Europa Jagiellonica, or Jagiellonica if you prefer. And that video I made it specifically about foreign policy in Central Eastern Europe, and it's relevant. I also made videos about the Lipka Tatars. You can see how already at this time, well, that's mostly concerning Lithuania in this earlier day, but how things were in fact going in this neighboring country already. I was thinking that we really need, I have a video about, well, okay, that's a bit later, medieval Polish-Lithuanian Cossack warfare between the 15th and 16th century, right? So actually there is so much already you can check out if you haven't, right? I hope that you are, the loyal follower that watches everything by Schwerpunkt. But I don't know, there's just so much to cover, and so all in all, nothing can be fully sort of watchable all the time, but if anything, but for time reasons, right? But also by interest, don't be afraid to explore, to find new videos, because this is also the unmitigated beauty of Schwerpunkt, that you can come across new stuff that you didn't think was there, but always ties into the whole thing. Here, for example, a very pertinent video. I will post everything in the top 6 comment down below, but there is probably a video made on Casimir III, Polish social, economic, demographic, urban, and cultural development under Casimir III, right? And that is, again, very much concerning what we discussed here. There isn't just the video about the Ostsiedlung in the 13th century, Poland, Bohemia, and Hungary. But it's important to get a perspective on this specific world, right? Central Europe as such, that is not Eastern Europe, it's not Northern Europe, it's not Western Europe, it's not Southern Europe, it's not other parts of Europe, however you want to subdivide. It's Central Europe. It's something very particular. And of course, within itself is different. And we just explain it in a sense, but right, it's important to acknowledge as a world on its own. And the Polish 14th century is sort of one of the most interesting. At least it gives you the sense of accomplishment, which is rare, considering like the turbulences of Polish history. This was a moment in which great part of the foundation of the later Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth would be laid, right? And so, in fact, I have also a video about the Polish-Lithuanian Union in the 15th century. The Commonwealth will officially come later, but still, they were mostly dynastic unions, eventually turning into something more cohesive, all right? And again, if you look at this in perspective, it's sort of very unique in a way. There are sort of different aspects of Polish history that actually amaze you for how non-feasible this political compaction would have been. Like further east, states collapse completely. Right here, at most, there is a very strong iron arm between the monarchy and the high nobility, and Poland is in fact the most successful country in some broader power sense. We've seen it still by the time of the end of the 17th century in the series about Vienna, that the Habsburgs barely could compete with that. And Central Europe was essentially falling asleep on the basis of what was established at this very point for centuries in terms of political, territorial extent, and so on, of the various powers. This is very important to understand, and that's why I insist very much on this area. We haven't made so many videos about Polish history as opposed to Bohemian one for some reason. I don't know why, but Bohemia is also underrated in many ways. But we won't have made enough until we are at 40, 50 each, right? And so it's what's enough, by the way. I can't see here much else to add, but I would say that for today I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.